On the 7th of December, 1993, a pregnant woman named Diane Schaap sat inside a hospital room in the city of Fulda, Germany, staring anxiously at the nurse who was checking her blood pressure. When the nurse was done, she told Diane that her blood pressure was still too high. Diane sighed, visibly upset by the news, but at the same time, she wasn't all that shocked. After all, Diane had come to the hospital because she felt something was wrong. Diane was an American living on the nearby Sickles Army Airfield Base with her husband, Sergeant Stephen Schaap. That morning, Diane had started to bleed, and because she had a history of miscarriages, she panicked and rushed to the hospital to get checked out. Ultimately, the doctors told her it seemed like she was going to be okay, and that the bleeding wasn't a major issue. However, as a precaution, they wanted her to stay in the hospital for a week on bed rest so they could monitor her and make sure everything was truly okay. So far, she was, but her blood pressure remained a concern. After finishing Diane's vitals, the nurse left the room, leaving Diane alone for the first time since she'd arrived. Suddenly, anxiety swept over her as she lay in bed, wondering if her pregnancy was really going to be okay. She heard footsteps in the hallway. Then, suddenly, her door burst open. It was her husband, Stephen. Stephen looked pale. His eyes were red. He appeared deeply upset. He rushed into the room, knelt beside Diane's bed, took her hand, and asked, "How are you doing?" It had been a hard stretch for Diane and Stephen. Just a few months earlier, Diane had asked Stephen for a divorce. She felt he had grown distant, and the love in their relationship had faded. Stephen, however, didn't want the divorce. He still believed they loved each other and could make it work, but he understood Diane was unhappy. He handled the situation respectfully and even went with her to the base's cleric, where they arranged for Diane to return to the United States while Stephen stayed in Germany. But before Diane could move back home, she found out she was pregnant. Stephen, who wanted to reconcile, was even more eager now to fix their relationship and be a father. But Diane knew that wasn't realistic. Their relationship just didn't work. So, as Stephen held her hand beside the hospital bed, Diane gently squeezed it and said, even though he hadn't brought it up, "We can't get back together, though I'm pregnant, it just can't happen." Stephen shook his head, as if to say he wasn't there to talk about that. "I just want to be your friend," he said. "Let me go back to your house and grab your things. I'll bring them here to make your stay a little more comfortable." Diane wanted to tell him no, that she was fine, but she could tell how much he wanted to help. So, against her better judgment, she said, "Okay, Stephen, if you want to get my stuff, I'd really appreciate it." Stephen stood up, gave Diane a long hug, and said, "I'll be right back." Then, he turned and left the room. A few hours later, around 5 p.m., the phone in Diane's hospital room rang. She answered. It was her husband's best friend, Gregory Glover. Gregory had heard Diane was in the hospital and called to check in and make sure the baby was okay. Diane told him everything seemed fine. Then Gregory said he was really worried about Stephen. He explained, "This morning I drove him to work, and all he did was pour his heart out about how badly he wants to get back together with you. I just want you to know he's really worked up about all of this." Before Diane could respond, the line suddenly went dead. She held the phone out, staring at it in confusion. "What's going on?" she muttered. She put it back to her ear and called out Gregory's name a few more times, but the line was completely silent. So Diane hung up the phone and assumed Gregory would call back. But 30 minutes went by, still no call. Then, out in the hallway, Diane heard running. Fast, urgent footsteps getting closer. The running continued down the hall and stopped directly outside her door. She turned to face it. The door flung open, and what she saw caused Diane to freeze in total shock. A few hours earlier, after Stephen had left Diane's hospital room, he had gone straight to her house to begin gathering things up for her. And so, when he got there, he had a gym bag, which was made by a sports and athletic company called Head. He had gone inside of her house and begun going around the rooms, gathering things she would want and putting them in this bag. At some point, Stephen made his way into Diane's bedroom, and suddenly he was just kind of overcome with sadness. He looked around the room and saw there were still pictures up from their wedding day, and there was a card that was face down on the bedside table that he recognized. Just all of these different things he was seeing suddenly made him feel so depressed about losing his marriage. And so, Stephen, instead of continuing to gather up things for Diane, just began pacing back and forth inside of her bedroom, thinking about ways he could potentially win Diane back. Maybe there was a gift he could give her, or some sort of offering or gesture that would show her that he still loved her very much. And so, as Stephen was thinking about this, he happened to glance down at his gym bag, and suddenly he felt totally inspired, like he knew exactly what he needed to do. And so, without another thought, Stephen grabbed something off of the mantelpiece inside of Diane's bedroom. He threw it inside of his gym bag, then he grabbed the bag and walked out of her house. Once Stephen was outside, he had a big smile on his face. He was even whistling as he walked. He went down and got into his car, and he drove off. But instead of going to the hospital where Diane was, Stephen began driving in these weird loops all around Sickles Army Airfield Base, almost like he was going on a joyride. But as he was driving, Stephen was constantly scanning left and right, like he was looking for something. Then, at some point, as he did one of his many loops, Stephen passed by the mess hall, the cafeteria, and he saw all the soldiers going in and out of this mess hall. He thought, "Oh, that's where it will be. The thing I need is inside of there." And so, Stephen parked his car, got out, and rushed inside of the mess hall. But after looking all around, he couldn't find the thing he wanted. And so, frustrated, he turned and walked out of the mess hall. But when he went back outside, as he was walking back to his car, something out of the corner of his eye caught his attention. He looked over, and it was this phone booth, right on the sidewalk up against the road, and he couldn't believe it, but there it was. There was the thing right near this phone booth that Stephen desperately wanted. And so Stephen, instead of going to his car, just began walking in a straight, very determined line towards this phone booth. 30 minutes later, Diane heard those running footsteps out in the hallway, and then her door flung open. She froze in shock at what she saw, because what she saw was her husband, and he had this totally crazed look on his face, like he was smiling, but kind of deranged. He was holding that head gym bag. He walked in holding the bag and just stared directly at Diane. Then he opened it up, reached inside, and pulled out his special gift, the thing he had been driving all around base for, that he had found inside of that phone booth. He walked up to Diane, put it right in her face, and said, "Look what I brought you. Look." By this point, Diane was screaming bloody murder. It would turn out, when Stephen first arrived at Diane's hospital room that morning, and he had knelt down and taken her hand and asked if she was okay, Diane had been very firm with him that they still could not get back together, even though she was pregnant now. This was crushing news for Stephen, because he did secretly hope that this baby would bring them back together. But what Diane told Stephen next was infinitely more crushing. She would say to Stephen that the real reason they could not get back together was because this baby was not his. Now, Stephen had initially taken this news pretty well and said to Diane, "Okay, I understand. At least let me go to your house and gather up some things for you and bring them back here so your stay at the hospital is a little bit more comfortable." Diane had maybe been a little bit surprised at how well Stephen had taken this, and she said, "Okay, yeah, that would be great." And so, Stephen had left the hospital, gone to Diane's house, went into her room, and began putting her things into that gym bag. Suddenly, he stopped, because he noticed those pictures on the mantelpiece of their wedding day. It was just kind of crushing to realize that his marriage really was over. Then, before he went back to packing, he happened to glance over at the bedside table and noticed a card face down on that table. Now, at first, Stephen actually didn't really react to this card, because he knew who had given it to Dianite was just a friend of hers, and the card was kind of meaningless. It was just a card to celebrate their friendship. But then, Stephen is suddenly thinking to himself, wait a minute, this person, this friend of Diane's, gives her cards all the time. This person is always coming over to say hi to Diane, and this person's always complimenting Diane and telling me how great Diane is. And it was like, suddenly, everything just kind of fell into place for Stephen. He realized this so-called friend of Diane's was much more than that. This friend was Diane's lover, and very likely the father of her unborn child. And who was this friend of Diane's? The same Gregory Glover that Stephen, just that morning, had poured his heart out to on the ride to work, telling Gregory how much he missed his wife and how much he wanted to reconcile. And Gregory's advice to Stephen had been, well, I know you're hurting, but you really need to let this go. You need to let the divorce happen and just move on with your life. And now, Stephen realized that Gregory wanted Stephen to end his relationship with his wife, so Gregory could have a relationship with Diane. And so, Stephen felt unbelievably betrayed, and that was when he decided to get a gift for Diane. And so, he grabbed the knife that was on the mantelpiece inside of Diane's bedroom. He threw it inside of his gym bag. He got in his car, and he began driving around the base looking for Gregory. And after Stephen had gone into the mess hall and then come back out again, he had spotted Gregory on the phone inside of that phone booth. And Stephen had immediately run over, opened it up, grabbed Gregory, pulled him out, and begun stabbing him. Now, Stephen didn't know this, but at the time he attacked, Greg was literally on the phone with Diane. And so, when that call suddenly dropped, and Diane expected Gregory to call her back, well, their call really hadn't dropped. It was just that Gregory had been pulled away and was being attacked. Gregory, who was totally caught off guard, tried his best to defend himself against Stephen, but Stephen was just crazed, and he kept hacking away until finally Gregory had stopped moving. And then, at some point, Stephen stood up and kind of caught his breath. And he's looking around at all these onlookers who can't believe what they're seeing. And Stephen said, "I'm sorry." He grabbed some things off the ground, put them inside of his gym bag, and then he took the bag. He ran to his car, drove to the hospital, ran through the hospital to Diane's room. He flung the door open, and Diane is shocked to see him. And Stephen walks in with this crazed look on his face, and he holds up the bag. He unzips it and pulls out Gregory's severed head. And he holds it right in front of Diane and says, "Look what I brought you. Look." And he placed it down right on the bedside table, looking directly at Diane. And so, Diane began screaming, and people began rushing into the room. Meanwhile, Stephen just sat in the corner, calmly waiting to be arrested. Ultimately, Stephen would be tried by a military court, and he would be sentenced to life in prison. On the 12th of September, 1916, residents of the little mining town called Kingsport, Tennessee, left their homes and packed the main street because on this day, a traveling circus called Sparks World Famous Shows was coming to town. The performers in this traveling circus were going to put on a big parade and then end it with a traditional circus act. This was going to be the most exciting and biggest event that had ever happened in Kingsport. Kingsport was not an affluent place. Most people lived in tents instead of homes, and many of the roads were mud. And so, they were really desperate for something fun and exciting to happen. By around noon, all the residents who were lining the main street began hearing the sound of music off in the distance. And then, from around the corner came clowns who were banging cymbals and blowing on kazoos. And then there were acrobats and dogs painted different colors. And there were men juggling and walking on stilts and walking upside down. There were horses and lions and trained sea lions. I mean, this parade was a total spectacle, and the residents of Kingsport loved it. They were screaming and cheering with excitement, but the most exciting part of this parade were the elephants. There were 5 of them, and they were at the front of the parade, and they each had their trunks wrapped around the other elephant's tail, so they were walking in a line. And the elephant at the very front of these 5 elephants was very clearly the star of the show. Her name was Mary. And the owner of the circus, whose name was Charlie Sparks, advertised Mary as being the largest living land animal on Earth. She weighed more than 5 tons, which is 10,000 pounds, and Charlie had her since she was a baby, and he had taught her many tricks. She could stand on her head, she could play 25 songs on a trumpet, and she could throw a baseball. Charlie loved Mary like she was his child, and Charlie knew that Mary was really his ticket to real success. At this time in America, There were lots of other traveling circuses that Charlie had to compete with, and generally speaking, Charlie's circus was on the smaller side. And so, this was frustrating for Charlie, because he was always trying to find new ways to grow his circus and make it more fun and enjoyable, but a lot of his efforts didn't really work out. However, he at least had Mary, who always seemed to draw a crowd. And when Mary walked down Main Street of Kingsport, everybody was totally amazed by her, and they were totally jealous of the man on her back who got to ride her. It was her handler. His name was Red Eldridge. When the parade finally came to an end, and Charlie was getting ready to shift the entire performance from parade to traditional circus act, Red, Mary's handler, took Mary and led her over to a nearby pond to let her get a drink of water. Red, who was 38 years old, was new to elephant handling. In fact, Charlie had hired him just a day earlier when Charlie's show had passed through Virginia, where Red was working as a janitor. Animal handlers in Charlie's show were all trained to treat the animals gently, especially Mary. But Red was a grouchy person who was a very skinny guy with bright red hair, and he had been teased for much of his life, which had kind of made him a mean person. And so, as he and Mary are walking over to this pond, Mary saw a watermelon on the ground and stopped to eat it. And as she was doing this, Red noticed there was a group of people kind of forming up around them, just kind of amazed by Mary. And they were noticing that Red was trying to get Mary to go to the pond to get a drink of water, and she wasn't listening. She was focused on the watermelon. And so, Red very likely started to feel insecure that they would think he wasn't in control of the animal. And so, he got mad, and he took his metal prod, and he jabbed it into the side of Mary's head, right behind her ear, breaking her skin. Now, Mary was a very gentle creature, but over the past 24 hours that Red had been her new handler, he had been cruel like this. And so, when he poked her with that prod, it was like Mary snapped. Mary dropped the watermelon, turned to face Red, and Reddy, startled by this, and just kind of stares up at Mary, wondering what's going on. And Mary would wrap up Red in her long trunk and throw him into a nearby drink stand. At this point, the crowd of children and other people from Kingsport who were watching Mary started to scream and run away. And Marishi was not done with Red, who was now groaning and rolling over onto his back. Mary walked over to Red, and then she got up on her hind legs and came crashing down directly, all 10,000 pounds of Toronto Red's skull, killing him instantly. Charlie heard all this commotion over near the pond, and he ran over, and he found Mary looking totally terrified. And so, he began to comfort her, and then he noticed on the ground next to her was Red's mangled body. And around this time, the townspeople who had run in fear had now come back, and they saw what Mary had done. And instead of being scared of Mary, all these townspeople got angry and began screaming at Mary the elephant, "Murderer!" This was, of course, a worst-case scenario for Charlie just from a business perspective, because Mary was the star of his show, and she had just very publicly killed her handler. In the hours after Red's death, news of murderous Mary began spreading around town and to other towns nearby. And before long, there was a mob of people trying to kill Mary, who had to be held back. And then also, the sheriff of Kingsport, at some point, came up to Mary and fired his gun at her. But Mary was so big, and her skin was so tough, the bullets did not penetrate. Also, within hours of Red being killed, the town that Charlie and his circus were supposed to go to next sent word that they were not allowed to come if Mary was going to be with them. Charlie knew that, at this point, even though Mary had been the star of his show, if he didn't get rid of her, he would be out of business. He'd be financially ruined. However, he loved Mary. She was his oldest and most loyal partner, and he couldn't imagine giving her up. But Charlie was also very ambitious, and he had a whole crew of people in his circus that depended on doing these shows to make a living. And so, on the night of Red's death, Charlie would lay awake all night just thinking about what he was going to do. And by early the next morning, Charlie had come up with a plan. Charlie ordered his entire circus to pack up and get back on the train. They were going to head to the next town, called Irwin. And Charlie said once they got there, They would put on a show that no one in the world had ever seen before. Sparks' world-famous shows arrived in Irwin at about 10 a.m. that day, and immediately, all the performers began setting up for this big show, which again would start with a parade, followed by a circus act, and then a grand finale. Now, Irwin was already packed by the time the circus actually arrived, because news of what Charlie had planned for this grand finale had reached Irwin and the surrounding towns. And so, everybody had flooded this town to see it. At midday, Charlie's team was ready, and they began the parade. But Mary was not a part of the parade. Instead, she was chained up inside of the main circus area, where the circus act would take place after the parade ended. And when the parade ended, it put on the circus act right around Mary. But Mary was not unchained. She was left in the middle of the circus, just kind of standing there, not sure what to do. She kind of swayed around with the music and trumpeted a few times, but she was confused, and no one really knew what she was doing there. And then finally, the main circus act came to an end, and most of the performers went back into their tents. And at this point, all of the crowd who had been watching this circus began making their way over to the railroad yard. At the same time, Charlie and several of the animal handlers came out and grabbed the 4 other elephants who were not chained up. And they went over to Mary, and they unchained her. And then they formed all the elephants up in a line, with each of the trunks connected to the tail of the next elephant. And they marched all 5 elephants over to the railroad yard, where now there was a massive crowd that also included the press, who had shown up with their cameras ready to capture the grand finale. Charlie led Mary and the other 4 elephants onto the railroad tracks, which were up on this embankment. And once they got up there, Charlie halted the other 4 elephants and sent them away with their handlers and left Mary all alone on the railroad tracks. And at this point, as Charlie is consoling her, one of the circus performers came over and chained Mary's back legs to the railroad tracks. Now, Mary was extremely well trained, and Charlie is right there comforting her. And so, even though she was nervous as she was getting chained up, she didn't try to fight it. And as this was happening, a railroad worker climbed into a machine called a derrick, which is basically a big crane that's able to lift heavy things like lumber off of the railroad cars. And so, this worker hops in the derrick, which is on tracks, and he brought it over right behind Mary. And so, once the derrick was in place, and once Mary was securely fastened to the tracks, another worker climbed up onto the crane of the derrick, so the actual arm that was jutting out over Mary. This worker climbed up on top of it, and he grabbed the chain that was dangling off of it, and he jumped onto Mary's back carrying this chain. And he looped it around Mary's neck and secured it, and then jumped off of Mary. At this point, Charlie, who was still holding on to Mary's trunk and comforting her, gave her one last embrace and then turned away from her and walked down the embankment toward the huge crowd, who had now gone totally silent, sensing the grand finale was about to start. Once Charlie reached the crowd, he turned around to face Mary. He signaled the railroad worker in the derrick, who then pulled a lever inside of the derrick. At this point, the only sound that could be heard across the whole railroad yard was the sound of this chain that had just been activated, slowly being retracted by the derrick. And so, as it was pulling Mary up off the ground by her neck. And so, as it tightened around Mary's neck, and she realized she couldn't go anywhere, because she's anchored to the tracks by her back legs, she began to panic. And she kept looking over at Charlie and trumpeting, trying to get someone to help her, but no help came. And eventually, the derrick tightened so much that it lifted Mary's front legs off the ground, and her back legs were still on the ground. And so, with one last look over at Charlie, she let out a trumpeting call, and then her back legs left the ground, and she went silent. And she was hung there until she died. Mary's public execution was Charlie's big grand finale to this show. He had killed off this murderous elephant in an effort to appease the masses and save his circus business. And it did work. His circus continued to grow for a number of years. I mean, lots of people were interested in coming to see whatever he was doing because of the infamy around Mary. But after killing Mary, Charlie was never the same. He would actually retire early and then die in 1944. Today, Irwin, Tennessee, is still known as the town that hung the elephant. On the morning of the 25th of March, 2009, 41-year-old Kay Parsons woke up in her bedroom in the quiet suburb of Grovetown, Georgia. It was still dark outside, but Kay knew she had a busy morning ahead of her, so she got right out of bed and walked down the hallway to wake up her son. When she went into his room, her son, who was 12 years old, immediately began complaining that he didn't want to wake up yet. But Kay just flipped on his lights and said, "Come on, you got to get ready for school." Once Kay saw her son actually climb out of bed and begin to get dressed, she rushed downstairs and poured him a bowl of cereal and left it on the table, and then called up to him and said, "Come on, come down, eat your breakfast." Then Kay rushed right back upstairs into her bedroom to get dressed. Normally, Kay had help with the morning routine from her husband David, but David was in Los Angeles on business. David was a career military man who had become a successful civilian contractor after retirement, which meant David worked for the military, but he was not actually a member of the military. Generally speaking, civilian contractors with the military make a lot of money. David's work at a nearby Army base is what had brought the family to Georgia 4 years earlier, and his job had allowed them to buy their beautiful 2-story, 4-bedroom home. But the trade-off with David's financial success was that he often had to travel for work, leaving Kay to manage on her own. Most of the time, Kay was perfectly happy to take on everything at home by herself because she knew David was doing his part for the family in other ways. Kay and David had been together since they were in high school, and people who knew them said they had the kind of partnership that made other couples jealous. They seemed to function as this perfect unit, and they always knew how to help the other. But the truth was, behind the scenes, Kay and David were not perfect, and lately they had been going through a really rough patch. They had been getting in these horrible fights, and then, after the fights would end, they would just ignore each other for long periods of time. So, as Kay rushed around her bedroom getting dressed for the day, she couldn't help but feel kind of resentful towards David for not being here that morning to help her. But Kay quickly told herself she was being foolish. Even though they were fighting, she knew the reason David was gone was for work. He was there to help the family, and so she couldn't really be resentful about it. Once Kay was finished getting dressed, she ran to her son's bedroom and grabbed his backpack, and then went back downstairs to the kitchen. When she got there, her son said he was done eating, so Kay handed him his backpack. Then she grabbed his empty cereal bowl and put it in the sink. Then she picked up her white leather handbag off the counter and took out her car keys. Then Kay stopped herself because she knew she was running around like a maniac, and she took a breath and then looked over at her son and smiled. Even when she and David were not getting along, they still made sure their son always felt like their house was filled with love and happiness. Kay's son smiled back at her, and then the two of them walked to the garage and got into Kay's car. Kay pulled out of the garage onto Hot Springs Drive, her quiet neighborhood street, and as she did, she looked over at the house next door, another beautiful brick home, strikingly similar to her own. In many ways, Kay and her family's lives in Grovetown were directly connected with that house next door. On the day that Kay, David, and their son had moved in, their next-door neighbors, Becky and Tony Sears and their 5 kids, had dropped by with food to welcome them to their new home. From then on, the two households became inseparable. The adults played tennis together. One of the Sears boys was on the same baseball team as Kay's son, and the two families had vacationed together. Becky even got Kay a job at Healing Hands, the physical therapy clinic where she worked, and not long after Kay and Becky had begun working together, they joined Weight Watchers together. Kay gave Becky a lot of credit for helping her meet her weight loss goals. Every day, Becky wanted to compare weights and discuss who had lost the most. It made Kay anxious, but she had to admit peer pressure worked. But in recent weeks, Kay had been so caught up in the problem she was having with her husband that she really hadn't even spoken to Becky. As Kay drove past Becky's house that morning, she wished she could go back in time to when everything had seemed so perfect. After Kay dropped her son off at school, she went to a McDonald's drive-thru. Even though Kay was a part of Weight Watchers and was trying to lose weight, when she was really stressed out or rushed, She often treated herself to fast food. Kay quickly ate her McDonald's breakfast in the car as she drove back home. She was in a hurry because her handyman, Mitch Cart, would be arriving at her house soon. Mitch was coming by to repair the back door. But as Kay drove, she was thinking about other projects she might ask him to take care of while he was already at the house. Kay was still lost in her own thoughts about what she was going to ask him to do when she pulled back into her two-car garage at around 7:15 a.m. Kay got out of her car and walked into the house, carrying a half-finished cup of McDonald's coffee and an empty fast food bag. Within seconds of stepping foot inside of her house, Kay heard a loud crashing sound in the kitchen. It sounded like something breaking. Kay had no idea how anything could be falling in her kitchen, and so she quickly rushed around the corner to see what was going on. But what she saw in the kitchen was the last thing she expected. At 8:30 a.m., Kay's handyman, Mitch, walked onto Kay's front porch and rang the doorbell. He knew Kay was expecting him, so he was surprised when no one answered the door. After a few moments, Mitch pulled out his flip phone and called Kay, but Kay didn't pick up. Mitch peeked in the windows of the home, but he couldn't see anyone inside the house, so he walked around to the back. He was there to fix the elegant French doors that were in the back of the house, and so he figured he could at least take a look at the job while he was waiting for Kay. But when Mitch came around the corner of the house and actually saw these French doors, he froze, because one of the panes of glass in the French doors was completely shattered, and the French door was open. He called out for Kay from the outside, but no one answered. Mitch had seen enough cop shows to know that he did not want to go inside this house himself and potentially leave fingerprints or footprints. So, instead, Mitch grabbed his phone again and he called 911 to report what appeared to be a break-in. As Mitch was talking to the 911 operator, he noticed this young man with black hair sitting on the other side of the road on this rock, just staring at Mitch. Then, as soon as Mitch got off the phone, the young man with black hair called out to him. Mitch walked across the street towards him, and as he did, he could see the young man looked pretty shaken up. When Mitch finally reached the young man, he told Mitch his name was Michael Bowers, and he lived next door to Kay. He was actually Kay's friend Becky's oldest son, who was from a previous marriage. Mitch asked Michael if he was okay, but Michael said no. He said he'd overheard Mitch's phone calls to 911, so he knew that Kay's house had been broken into, and he told Mitch that his own house had been broken into as well. He said the house was ransacked, with drawers emptied onto the floor and the whole place was a mess. Michael said he had just called his mother at work to let her know. At this point, Mitch was very worried, and he told Michael to stay right where he was and to not go back inside of his house, because whoever had broken in might still be there. Then Mitch went back across the street to his truck, and he pulled out the gun he kept in the glove compartment, just in case. Then he went back across the street and waited with Michael for the police to arrive. A few minutes later, Sergeant Jimmy Edmonds of the Columbia County Sheriff's Office arrived at Kay's house. His office had received 2 calls within minutes of each other to report break-ins in neighboring houses on Hot Springs Drive. Edmonds thought just one break-in would be very unusual for such a quiet, low-crime neighborhood, but 2 break-ins. Something strange was going on. Sheriff's deputies arrived on the scene soon after, and at that point, Edmonds walked around the house with them to the back door with the shattered glass. Before Edmonds even went inside the house, he saw an ominous sign. He could clearly see blood on the kitchen floor. Edmonds turned back around and looked at the deputies and made sure they saw the blood too, and they nodded. Then Edmonds led them into the house, and immediately Edmonds saw the blood trail went all the way out of the kitchen and down the front hall. The blood was not just on the floor. There was also blood spattered all over the walls too. As Edmonds followed this grotesque blood trail all through the house, he passed by a spilled McDonald's coffee and a crumpled McDonald's bag and a white handbag on the floor. Then he saw a bloody handprint on the wall right beside the door to the garage. He opened up the door, and there, lying beside her car in a big pool of blood, was Kay Parsons. Edmonds quickly rushed over and crouched down beside Kay and placed his fingers on the inside of her wrist. And amazingly, he found a pulse. Kay was alive. So Edmonds shouted for one of the deputies to call an ambulance. As Edmonds stayed crouched down with Kay, telling her over and over again that help was on the way. Edmonds just could not believe the amount of blood he was seeing, not just all over the house, but on Kay, on her face, her arms, her clothes. He had been investigating violent crime for years, but he'd never seen someone beaten as badly as Kay Parsons was. There was a bloodied aluminum baseball bat lying beside Kay, and Edmonds was reasonably sure it had been used to bludgeon her. Then Edmonds also noticed there was a second weapon underneath the car, a bloody claw hammer. Seconds later, the ambulance finally arrived, and Kay was rushed to the hospital. As soon as she was gone, Edmonds led a room-by-room search of her house. At first glance, it looked to Edmonds like Kay must have come home and interrupted a robbery in progress. The house was a complete mess, upstairs and downstairs, as though someone had run through the entire house, searching every single drawer as quickly as possible. But the sheer brutality of the attack on Kay made Edmonds think this could be something else. I mean, what kind of burglar would suddenly begin bludgeoning someone to death with a hammer and bat just because they interrupted them? This just felt like a deeply personal crime to Edmonds, not just some random robbery. At some point during the room-by-room search, Edmonds stepped away and performed the grim duty of calling Kay's husband, David, to tell him what happened. Now, Edmonds didn't really go into any details over the phone. He just told David that he would need to fly home from Los Angeles immediately. David could tell, obviously, something terrible had happened, and by the time he hung up, David was reasonably sure that his wife had been badly injured. So he booked the first flight back to Georgia and rushed to the airport. Back at Kay's house, Edmonds knew he still had a second break-in to investigate, and he was afraid he would find another victim of a vicious attack. So Edmonds rounded up a few other deputies and walked next door to the Sears' home. The back door had been broken open, just like over at Kay's house, and the contents of drawers in the Sears' home had been dumped all over the place, just like in Kay's house. There were also smears of blood here and there, but not nearly as much as next door. The deputies combed the house from top to bottom, and luckily, they did not find another victim. Edmonds was searching the ransacked kitchen for potential evidence when Becky Sears, the mother, and her 19-year-old son, Chris, came into the backyard. Becky told Edmonds they had both been at work when her other son, Michael, had called to tell her about the break-in. So they had rushed home as fast as they could. But Becky did not care at all about the fact that her house had been trashed and ransacked, because moments before Becky had walked into her house, a neighbor had told her that her good friend Kay had been taken away in an ambulance. So all Becky wanted to know now from Edmonds was if Kay was okay. Edmonds was not really able to share any details about Kay, other than the fact that she had been alive when she was taken to the hospital. Within minutes, another neighbor appeared at the Sears' house and offered to give Becky and Chris a ride to the hospital to go check on Kay. And so Becky and Chris, they rushed out the door with that neighbor as fast as they had shown up, and Edmonds was suddenly left alone in the quiet kitchen, thinking about all these terrible things that had just unfolded in the small, seemingly safe suburban neighborhood. Edmonds figured Kay's house must have come first. The person who broke in killed Kay, and then they must have come over to Becky's house next, but still had Kay's blood on their hands. That was why there was blood in both houses, despite there only being a victim in Kay's house. But that didn't make Edmonds feel much better. He now knew he was dealing with a criminal who was cool enough and cruel enough to beat this helpless woman until they were totally covered in her blood, and then casually just go next door, still covered in blood, to rob another house. Edmonds wondered what kind of person could do something like that. Becky and some of Kay's other friends stood vigil in Kay's hospital waiting room all day long. They were desperate to get any word on Kay's condition. Every so often, Becky would ask one of the nurses if she could go in to see her friend, but they always said no, because the medical team was still trying to stabilize Kay. Eventually, another friend did make it to Kay's actual bedside, and she didn't even recognize the heavily bandaged person lying there. Kay's face was grotesquely swollen, and she was attached to all kinds of tubes and wires that were keeping her alive. The nurse wouldn't answer when the friend asked if Kay was brain dead. Finally, late in the afternoon, Kay's husband, David, arrived at the hospital straight from the airport. Sergeant Edmonds and other officers escorted David past Kay's friends to Kay's room, and they let him go in there all by himself. Seconds later, from beyond the double doors, Kay's friends heard David begin to sob. Kay had just died. Some of Kay's friends began to weep when they heard David crying, but Sergeant Edmonds had a different reaction to David. He wondered if David's loud display of grief was just a bit too much. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but Edmonds got the sense that David was just performing for an audience. While Edmonds was at the hospital, members of his investigative team had gone door to door all throughout Kay's neighborhood to try to get more information about what happened. But unfortunately, so far, they'd come up with nothing. Nobody in the neighborhood had heard or seen anything unusual between 7 and 8:30 a.m. that morning. So after Edmonds got back to the sheriff's department, he decided he would just bring in all of the people who had been at the crime scene one by one. He started with Kay's handyman, Mitch. Once Mitch arrived at the station, Edmonds and Mitch sat down across from each other in a small interview room. Edmonds watched Mitch right away fight back tears as he recounted showing up at Kay's house and finding the smashed glass in the back door. Edmonds was initially skeptical of Mitch's story. After all, this guy had just happened to show up at the house right after Kay had been attacked. But Mitch showed Edmonds some emails that made it clear Kay really had been expecting him at her house at 8 a.m. that morning. And when Edmonds had searched Kay's house earlier, he hadn't seen any sign that Mitch ever went inside. So for the time being, Edmonds decided Mitch was not a major suspect. But just when Edmonds was starting to think Mitch would have nothing useful to offer, Mitch began talking about the young man with black hair who was sitting on the other side of the street and had overheard his 911 call. The young man had told Mitch that his name was Michael and that he was Becky's oldest son. The mention of Michael made Edmonds' mind start racing. He had learned through his initial investigation that Becky's oldest son had a history of drug problems. The 22-year-old had once been a heroin addict. And Edmonds wanted to know why Michael was sitting across the street from Kay's house, now a murder scene, instead of in front of his own house, which had just been looted. Because remember, Michael didn't know what was going on in Kay's house until he overheard Mitch talk about Kay's house being robbed. So Edmonds couldn't help but wonder if maybe Michael had tried to rob Kay's house to pay for his drug habit. But then Kay surprised him by coming home. She would have known Michael's face very well, and so maybe he decided to kill her so she wouldn't be able to identify him. Edmonds thanked Mitch for his help and ultimately let him go. Then he summoned Michael to the station. When Michael arrived, Edmonds led him into the small interrogation room, and the two sat down on opposite sides of a table. Michael was quiet and very polite, and as he sat there, he absently ran his hands through his dark black hair. Edmonds was very blunt and asked Michael if he was still using drugs. Michael admitted that he was. He said he was still fighting his heroin addiction, and in fact, that day he had used methadone to try to curb his heroin cravings. Methadone is a medication that's often used to help people reduce or stop their use of heroin or other opiates. And so, because Edmonds had wondered if Michael went to Kay's house to rob her to pay for drugs, Edmonds began to zero in on where Michael had been before the handyman Mitch had discovered the break-in at Kay's house. Michael stayed calm and polite. He claimed that his mother had dropped him off at 7 a.m. for a house painting job. But when Edmonds pressed Michael for details about this job, Michael's story fell apart. He couldn't say who he was, working for, or even where the job was. Now Michael was starting to shift around in his seat uncomfortably. So Edmonds asked him again where he had been when Kay was attacked. Michael admitted he had been lying about the house painting job, but only because he didn't want his mother to know he was unemployed. He said he had really been watching television at a friend's house. Edmonds was very annoyed that Michael had just lied to him, so he got up and walked out of the room. He would keep Michael in that interrogation room for 3 more hours while he decided what to do with him. In the end, Edmonds and his team, despite their suspicions, knew they really had no evidence linking Michael directly to the crime, so they couldn't just hold him indefinitely. But just before Edmonds was about to turn him loose, on a hunch, he asked Michael if he could look at the bottom of his sneakers. When Michael showed him, Edmonds saw that wedged into one of the treads of one of his shoes was a gleaming shard of glass. When Edmonds asked Michael where the glass came from, Michael had no explanation. And so, As Michael walked out the door of the sheriff's office, he didn't know it, but he had just become Sergeant Edmonds' primary suspect. Not long after Michael left the sheriff's office, his 19-year-old brother Chris arrived for his interview. Chris was everything that Michael was not. He had a job, he had his own house, he had respectable friends. And he was so nervous when he sat down for his interview that Edmonds had to keep reassuring him that he was not actually in trouble. Chris said that he had gotten up that morning at about 7 a.m. He'd barely had enough time to brush his teeth before his mother, Becky, pulled up to his house. He had agreed to go work with Becky that day at the physical therapy clinic, where she was the office manager. Chris was going to help out with several odd jobs around the building. But when his brother Michael had called about the break-in, Chris and his mom had left the clinic right away. Then Edmonds got Chris talking about his brother Michael, and the conversation soon turned to Michael's drug habit. Chris confirmed that his brother was taking methadone again, struggling with his heroin addiction, and hanging with a very bad crowd. At this, Edmonds immediately grabbed a sheet of paper and a pen and asked Chris to tell him the names of the people Michael was spending his time with, people who, in theory, might commit the kind of violent crime he was investigating. Chris looked at him and said, "You might need a larger piece of paper." By midday on the 26th of March, 24 hours after Kay had been discovered, Sergeant Edmonds was totally exhausted. He hadn't slept at all in the last 24 hours, but he knew he had a killer loose in his town, so he had no choice but to press on. And the more he found out, the more he suspected Kay's neighbor, Michael. First, Edmonds talked to the friend Michael claimed he was with at the time of the murder. In a recorded conversation at the sheriff's office, Michael's friend emphatically said that he and Michael really had been watching television together when Kay was attacked. But the friend offered to take a polygraph test right then and there, and he failed. Later that afternoon, Edmonds called the owner of the physical therapy clinic where Kay's friend Becky worked. The owner told Edmonds that Becky's son Michael had once stolen a company checkbook and written about $800 in bad checks before he was caught. The owner said he had agreed not to call the police after Becky promised that her son Michael would never step foot in the clinic again. But Edmonds still wondered whether the seemingly very laid-back and low-key Michael really had it in him to commit such a totally violent crime, especially against a woman who seemed so defenseless. Still, the evidence was stacking up. The murder was looking more and more like a robbery gone wrong, either committed by Michael or one of his friends, and very likely just to get money for drugs. That evening, Michael and Chris's mother, Becky, was leaving work at the physical therapy clinic. As she was walking down a dark walkway toward the parking lot, she thought she heard something in the bushes behind her. Becky turned around to see what the noise was, and she was totally startled to see a man wearing black clothes and a white baseball cap standing there in the bushes. Becky froze. The man just started shouting at her that he wanted his money. Becky said she had no idea what he was talking about, but the man clearly was not playing around. He raised a gun and started waving it right in her face. But Becky really didn't know anything about any money, so she kept saying, I don't know. Finally, the man seemed to have had enough. He lowered the gun from Becky's face to her left leg, and he fired it right into her shin. The bullet glanced off the bone and grazed Becky's right ankle. She felt a sharp pain rushing through both her legs, and she collapsed to the ground. As Becky lay there stunned and bleeding, staring up, waiting to get shot again, the man actually lowered the gun and said, "Next time, I'm going to shoot you right in the face." Then the man just turned and ran off into the darkness. Becky, who was totally in shock and had no idea what was going on, still managed to grab her phone from her pocket and call 911. After an ambulance arrived and took Becky to the hospital, sheriff's deputies searched the nearby woods for the shooter. They didn't find him, but all of them assumed one thing: this attack was not random. This shooting had to be connected to the break-ins on Hot Springs Drive and to Kay's murder. Becky was resting comfortably in her hospital bed when Sergeant Edmonds arrived to speak with her. Becky seemed perfectly fine to talk about what happened, and she gave Edmonds a very detailed account of her attack. But when Edmonds asked her if there was any way her son Michael could have had something to do with the shooting, she was very quick to reject it. Edmonds speculated to Becky that perhaps her son Michael owed the shooter drug money, so the shooter was taking it out on Michael's mother. But Becky responded by saying no, her son used to owe people money, but he didn't anymore. He didn't have debts anywhere. Edmonds could see that this line of questioning was likely going nowhere. Becky, despite her situation, seemed very set on protecting her kids. Which makes sense. You know, even if her son was guilty, she's going to protect him. So Edmonds decided to try a new tactic. He asked Becky if she had any relationship troubles. Was there anyone in her personal circle who might want to hurt her? Becky didn't answer. She turned away from Edmonds and just kind of stared off into the distance. Then, without looking at him, she told him that she had a terrible secret that she had to get off her chest. Becky told Edmonds she had cheated on her husband. She said her husband was a truck driver, which meant he was away a lot, and during his absences, she had turned to another man for comfort. But she insisted the affair was over, and that she and her husband were working out their issues now. Edmonds had a lot more questions, but right at that moment, nurses began coming in and out of Becky's room to check on her. So for the time being, Edmonds just kind of let the topic slide, without even finding out who this other man was, who Becky had been romantically involved with. The next morning, the 27th of March, Edmonds was hoping that his third cup of coffee might finally wake him up. His investigation was only a few days in, but Edmonds had been going non-stop. Just then, Sergeant Edmonds' phone rang, and so he picked it up. Before he could even call out a greeting, the person who was calling him said they had information about Kay's murder that he needed to hear. Edmonds asked who the caller was, but they would only say they were close to Becky and her family. Then the caller said they knew who Becky was having an affair with. It was Kay's husband, David. The caller said the neighbors, Becky and David, had been having the affair for 6 months before the murder, writing love letters back and forth and hooking up all over town. Becky wanted both of them to leave their spouses so they could be together, but David was worried that he would lose custody of his son if he split from his wife. After the anonymous caller hung up, Edmonds desperately wanted to talk to Kay's husband, David, but he knew he would have to wait until after Kay's funeral, which was that afternoon. At Kay's funeral, David was surrounded by loving supporters who had no idea that he had been cheating on his murdered wife. But one of Kay's closest friends couldn't shake the feeling that David was acting strangely for a man at his wife's funeral. When she had given David a hug, he told her that he was sorry and that he never wanted this to happen. The friend didn't understand what that meant, but she didn't think it was the right time to ask. At the end of the service, David, Becky, and all of Kay's loved ones looked on with sorrowful expressions as 6 pallbearers carried Kay's casket out of the church. Then the pallbearers put the casket into a hearse for the trip to the cemetery. David walked with his son to a waiting car that would follow the hearse, but Sergeant Edmonds approached and stopped them. Edmonds took David by the arm and quietly told him that they needed to talk right away. He said he understood that the family was obviously grieving, but really, this couldn't wait. Edmonds asked David to come to the station right after Kay was interred that evening. David looked emotionally raw and weary when he sat down across from Edmonds in the small interrogation room at the sheriff's station. Edmonds then told David, point blank, that he was in serious trouble and that he would not be doing his son or his family any good if he lied right now to the police and ended up going to jail. David seemed to know what this was about, and he nodded in agreement. Then Edmonds asked him about the affair with Becky, and David definitely saw this coming, because right away he just began confessing. David said his affair with Becky had started about 6 months earlier when she had flirted with him on the tennis court. They had been playing doubles against Becky's husband and Kay. When Becky had made a bad shot, she had leaned in close and said to David that she was playing badly because he was distracting her. Not long after that, the two began meeting at his house, her mother's house, or in their cars like it was some kind of high school romance. David said that he and Becky had pledged their love for each other, but he was just not ready to upset his own marriage. He worried that if he got divorced, Kay would take their son far away from him and prevent him from seeing him. So David and Becky's affair remained secret, but then David said he had broken things off with Becky a month before Kay's murder. David had told Becky they couldn't be together, at least until his 12-year-old son had graduated from college. David said that Becky was devastated, but she had accepted his decision and decided instead to focus on her own relationship with her husband. And Becky really had begun working on that relationship with a bracing dose of honesty. She admitted to her husband that she had been having an affair with their neighbor, David, and her husband did not take it well. He was shocked and furious, and he immediately called Kay to ask if she knew that her husband David was having an affair with his wife, Becky. Kay was totally caught off guard and said she absolutely did not know that. After that, David had no choice but to confess to Kay about the affair and then beg for Kay's forgiveness. And to his surprise, Kay had accepted his apology and said they would work through their crisis together. But Kay had said she would not have her family living next door to Becky any longer. She wanted to sell the house immediately. Kay had also quit her job, where she and Becky worked together, and she vowed never to speak to her former friend again. David said he was done speaking to Becky too, and that he was ready to make a fresh start. When David finished talking, Edmonds just stared at him for a second, and then looked down at his notes. Edmonds had all of David's cell phone records, and he knew that David had continued talking to Becky after their supposed breakup, including a call that lasted nearly 2 hours on the night before Kay's murder. And when Edmonds brought this up, that clearly David had just lied to him about his real relationship with Becky, David's face turned beet red, but he pressed ahead. Again, he admitted he had spoken to Becky numerous times after the breakup, but it was just to see how she was holding up. But on the night before Kay's murder, when David was in Los Angeles on business, he admitted that that long conversation he had had with Becky had turned sexual. And on that call, they had both admitted that they still had strong feelings for each other. Edmonds said that could explain the call David made the night before the murder. But David had also called Becky right around the time Kay was bludgeoned to death. So Edmonds wanted to know what that call was about. David said he had only talked to Becky on the morning of the murder because, at the time, he'd been worried about his wife. Kay hadn't picked up when he had called her, so, kind of out of desperation, he had just called Becky to see if maybe she had heard anything about Kay. Edmonds didn't say anything back to David, but inside, he wondered if the real reason David had called right at that time was to find out if his wife had been murdered yet. David seemed to know exactly what Sergeant Edmonds was thinking, so David quickly denied having anything to do with Kay's death. He said the last thing he would ever want to do was take his son's mother away from him. Before David could say anything else, Edmonds cut him off and said, "You know, desperate people do desperate things." At this, David just kind of hunched over and fell silent. It was now dark outside, and the interview had gone on for 3.5 hours. Edmonds stood up, stretched, excused himself, and walked out of the room. Then, once he was outside the room, he watched from the other side of the one-way glass as David started to cry. And as he cried, all they could hear David saying to himself was, "Everyone is going to blame me." Edmonds knew David had been in Los Angeles at the time of Kay's murder, but after this meeting with David, he thought David could have been involved in some way. After all, David's wife was murdered, and the woman he'd been having an affair with was in the hospital from a gunshot wound. Later that evening, Edmonds was at his desk when he received a very strange call from an inmate at the county jail. The inmate said he knew who killed Kay Parsons. Edmonds asked why he should trust a guy who was in jail at the time when Kay had died, so how could he possibly know the truth? And the inmate just said Edmonds really needed to trust him because, before he ended up in jail, Kay's killer had asked him to help with this murder. Edmonds was reasonably convinced that this guy had information, but the inmate made it clear to Edmonds that he wanted to give him the information in person. So Edmonds hung up, and he immediately headed to the jail. And Edmonds was waiting inside of an interview room when guards escorted in a middle-aged man dressed in pink jail sweats and flip-flops. The inmate did not hold anything back when he spoke to Edmonds, and by the time Edmonds left the county jail, he had multiple new leads to follow up on. And within days, those leads would pay off, and the police would finally figure out who had killed Kay, based on information provided by that inmate and evidence found at the crime scene. And through interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Kay Parsons on the morning of the 25th of March, 2009. At around 7:15 a.m., the killer saw Kay's car driving down the street toward her house. So the killer quickly darted around to the back of Kay's house, to those French doors. The killer had a claw hammer in their hand, and after looking around to make sure nobody could see them, they raised the hammer and smashed in one of the glass panes on the French doors. Then the killer reached in through the opening, unlocked the door, and stepped inside Kay's kitchen. Now, at the same time this was happening, Kay was actually entering the home through the front door. The killer figured Kay must have heard the glass shattering, so they clutched their hammer tightly and waited to see what Kay would do. A few seconds later, Kay walked into the kitchen to see what was going on, and she saw a person standing there, carrying a hammer. Naturally, she began to scream. Before Kay could turn and run, the killer leapt at her and swung the hammer wildly. Kay immediately threw her arms up to protect her head and face, but the killer just kept beating her arms with the hammer, over and over again, until she lowered them. At that point, the killer began smashing Kay in the head and torso. Blood began spraying everywhere. Kay stumbled backward out of the kitchen, barely conscious, but somehow she managed to turn and actually run away from her killer. The killer was totally shocked that, at this point, Kay was still on her feet. For a second, the killer just stood there, watching as Kay stumbled down the hallway. But when Kay actually reached the door that led into the garage, the killer realized what they needed to do and chased after her. Kay got the door open and managed to walk into the garage. But by this point, she had lost so much blood and was so badly beaten that she just fell to the ground by her parked car. The killer rushed into the garage after her and stood over Kay, raising the hammer. But the hammer was slick from all the blood, and when the killer tried to bring it down, it slipped out of their hand and slid under Kay's car. In a panic, the killer looked around the garage for another weapon to finish Kay off. Their eyes fell on an aluminum bat propped up against the wall. The killer lunged for the bat, came back over to Kay, and stood there, bludgeoning her over and over and over again until she wasn't moving. The killer, the garage, and Kay were now all covered in blood, and the killer was reasonably sure that Kay was dead. They had no idea she actually still had a pulse. The killer dropped the bat and ran back into the house. They trashed every room inside, throwing things on the ground and doing whatever they could to make it look like a robbery. Then, feeling satisfied, the killer crept out through the open French door, stepping on broken glass as they left. Once outside, the killer glanced back and forth to make sure nobody had seen them. Then they ran right next door into Becky's house and ransacked that place too. But then, instead of leaving, the killer stripped off their bloody clothes and found a fresh set of clothes in the house to change into. Then they grabbed their phone and called their mother. It would turn out Becky's heroin-addicted son Michael, who everybody assumed was involved in some way with this murder, had nothing to do with it. Becky's other son, Chris, the so-called good son, had been the one who murdered Kay. Chris had always been Becky's favorite child, and he would do anything to make his mom happy. Becky had told Chris things about her life that she would never tell her other son, Michael. So Chris was aware of the fact that his mom was having an affair with their neighbor David, and that she believed David was actually still in love with her. Chris also came to believe that their neighbor Kay was standing in the way of his mother's happiness. In fact, Becky had even said to Chris that she wanted Kay dead. All of this information began to come to light when Sergeant Edmonds met with the inmate who had called him. It turned out the inmate was Becky's own brother. He told Sergeant Edmonds that Becky had asked him if he knew anyone who could kill Kay and make it look like an accident. At first, he had thought she was joking, but after Becky kept pressing him, he knew she was serious. So when he learned that Kay really had been killed, he was sure his sister had something to do with it. That's why he reached out to Sergeant Edmonds. Now, after hearing this from the inmate, Edmonds still believed Michael had to be involved, that maybe Becky had asked him to carry out the murder. But when Edmonds questioned Michael again, it was clear the young man had no idea about his mother's affair. So Edmonds went back to the hospital to meet with Becky, who was still recovering from her gunshot wounds. He interrogated her, and she finally cracked. She admitted that she had told her other son, Chris, all about the affair and about how much she hated Kay. But Becky didn't stop there. She told Edmonds that she had asked Chris to confront Kay on her behalf on the morning of the murder. She claimed she didn't think her son would do anything violent. But after Chris had killed Kay and then came back to his own house, he staged another break-in and changed out of his bloody clothes. Then he called his mother and told her he had just murdered Kay. She had driven to the house, picked Chris up, and gone with him to dispose of his bloody clothes. Then when they came back to the house because her other son Michael had called her saying, "Oh my goodness, our house has been broken into." When she and Chris returned, the police were already there. Becky told the police right away that she and Chris had been working at the clinic all that morning. Then, after that, Becky and Chris staged the shooting outside of Becky's work. Chris was the shooter who had leapt out of the bushes. Becky hoped this shooting would remove suspicion from her and her family and allow Chris to get away with Kay's murder. Even after admitting all of that, Becky still insisted she had nothing to do with Kay's death. She told Edmonds that she had just totally messed up by giving her son Chris the impression that she really wanted him to go do something horrible to Kay. But police and prosecutors didn't believe that Becky was as innocent as she claimed, so both she and her son, Chris, were arrested. Ultimately, Becky and Chris pleaded guilty to Kay Parsons' murder. Today, both are serving life sentences with no chance of ever getting out.